Okay, I think we'll go ahead and start the webinar. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Revelwood webinar, Long-Term Planning Approaches and Reasons for Thinking Ahead. Quick housekeeping item, if you have any questions, please enter those in the chat, and we will do our best to answer those. If not, we will absolutely follow up with answers to the questions that you provide to us. Welcome, I'm Stan Pinnell, Senior Account Executive with Revelwood, and today I'm joined by my colleague, Lee Lazaro, Revelwood's Planning Analytics Practice Leader. Today, we're going to take you through the following agenda as part of the webinar. I'm going to provide you with a background of Revelwood, and then I'm going to hand it over to Lee, who's going to take you through the majority of the webinar, discussing different levels of planning, different approaches, and actually doing a demonstration of some of those approaches. We'll talk about client examples and give examples of those, things to consider when you're looking at different planning approaches, and then finally, next steps. So about Revelwood, Revelwood is an IBM Premier Business Partner. We've been in business since 1995, 25 plus years. As you can see, we're an award-winning IBM Analytics Partner, #1 TM1 Gold Accreditation, and various other awards. Really a sign of our history of success in implementations and the knowledge that we bring to the planning analytics world. We've done hundreds of successful planning analytics implementations with all different sizes and types of companies and industries. We have a fully staffed team of certified planning analytics consultants. And really what differentiates our consulting group from others are that we bring not only the technical background to each and every project, but also we have the financial acumen that we bring as well. So we can talk your talk. So with that said, I'm going to hand over the webinar to Lee. So Lee, if you want to take it from here.
Thanks, Dan. Good afternoon, everybody. Hope everybody is well and safe. So talking about planning. Every company and every industry is different, but the approaches for planning are typically associated with time, not with any industry-specific details. So with that being said, what I want to do is I want to start by looking at the different levels of planning by associating it with time. Short-term. So the approach associated with short-term planning is very, very detailed. Monthly. So a lot of people think of their short-term plan as monthly. Some of our clients even look at it as weekly. One of our clients does a weekly plan, and every week they have a process where Monday and Tuesday they open up the planning for the various planning personnel to go in, put their individual details in. Tuesday night it gets locked down. Wednesday and Thursday the managers come in, they review the weekly plan, and then on Thursday night it gets locked down. Friday, the overall approach is the high-level execs will take a look at it, and then they have a final updated plan. And then the following week, they look at it again. They reassess the process. And the approach that they use is very, very detailed. In this particular case, they go down all the way down to specific customers. Some clients will go all the way down to products. And because it's so short-term, our confidence level is very, very high. We're not looking too far into the future. We have a good understanding of the facts. We have the ability to go very, very granular. And that's where a lot of clients will look at short-term. Other clients will look at short-term in terms of what I'm going to reference here as medium-term. They're potentially looking at a few quarters, maybe even going out the year. A lot of the people on this call will think of that as their normal forecast. Normal forecast is where I'm looking at the data monthly. Instead of going down weekly, I'm going a little bit higher level where I'm looking at my data monthly. And I'm going a little further out. Instead of looking at a short term where I'm only focusing on my quarter, maybe I'm focusing on the rest of the year. Well, the fact that I'm looking at it a little bit higher level, the fact that I am looking at it a little less granular is where my confidence level is a little bit lower. It's definitely not in guessing mode, but it's definitely not in I know exactly what's going to happen. Okay. And then we get into the bigger picture, what the presentation is that we're talking about today. And it's more of a long term. Longer times, almost always longer than a year when people look at their long-term plan. A lot of people think of it as a 3-year and a 5-year plan, but some of our clients go even further. The movie industry, the pharmaceutical industry, some of the long-term plans go out 20, 25 years. Because of the fact that it's going out so far, they're looking at the bigger picture. They have larger goals. They're not necessarily looking at, tell me about GL account 123, or tell me about customer 456. They're looking at more of the bigger picture. How can we expand the company? How can we look into acquisitions? And they're using it as more of a growth approach, but they're bringing it back to the short and medium term, because using that long term, we can make it into a measuring tool to review the progress of how are we doing? Is our short-term plan on pace with the long term? Okay. So now we've talked about the different approaches at a high level. Let's look a little bit deeper into how they differ. So for purposes of this grid, I'm going to break down the approaches either under 1 year or over 1 year. First column, short and medium term, that's what I'm going to call under 1 year. The long term, over 1 year. Okay. Level of detail, just like we had said in the previous slide, the level of detail at the shorter term is much more granular. I'm looking at specific in TM1 terminology and planning analytics terminology. I'm looking at elements. I'm looking at specific account elements or specific cost centers and specific months. But as we go further into the longer term, we're looking at more groups. We're looking at consolidated elements. Instead of looking at accounts 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 4, and 1, 2, 5, maybe I'm looking at total assets. And instead of looking at cost centers 1, 2, and 3, maybe I'm just looking at the entire company. It gives us the ability to do more consolidations, and we definitely look at it at a more consolidated time. And from the calculation standpoint, as we're more granular, as we're more short-term, we can create intricate calculations. We might do benefits by person, where we have lookup tables and we have a series of different people, and we have a whole bunch of intricate details with that. Maybe there's multiple bonus plans that we want to look at by person. But as we go further into the longer term, we want to make it easier. We want to have fewer types of calculations. Not necessarily just fewer calculations, but fewer types, fewer different types. Module standpoint. In the short term, we have a lot of modules. Almost everybody on this call has a series of cubes. They have a series of modules. Each of those modules, there's a good chance that it's a different approach. Compensation model might use the approach where I'm plugging in information into the system, I'm getting a bunch of results out, and maybe revenue uses a completely different approach where it's more driver-based. But as we look further into the long term, we had previously said that we want fewer types of calculations. Well, because we want fewer types of calculations, we want fewer differences, and therefore there's going to be fewer cubes and fewer modules because the approaches are a little more similar. And from a starting point, this is also a little bit different. In the short term, there's a lot of different possibilities. Maybe I'm using existing data. Maybe I'm doing something zero-based. Maybe I'm giving my users some kind of a reference to look at. But in the long term, it's very rarely zero-based. In the long term, it's usually set up as, let me grab some data that's already there, use it as a starting point, and then put some kind of assumptions in. Yeah. So why are we doing this? The reason that we're doing this is because it helps us define the company direction. We want to figure out where are we going. We want to look into mergers and acquisitions. We want to look into the products that we're selling, the geographies that we're working with, the different verticals. But one of the things to think about is a lot of people will look at this when they do the company direction and then they think about what can I add? But the long-term plan isn't necessarily just what they can add. It could also be removing. It could also be changing. It could give us the ability to add something different. Maybe I joined a different vertical. It could give us the opportunity to define our products and determine maybe this product doesn't make sense anymore. And once we figure out where we want to go, then we figure out what do we need to get there? Resource requirements, cash. So we need to know what kinds of cash we have on hand, partially for situations like we're in right now, where the equity, the markets have some challenges, partially because it goes into debt payments, partially because it goes into how does it impact your balance sheet and cash flow. We want to look into requirements such as labor, not necessarily how much headcount are we going to have, but also maybe what type of headcount. Do we, using the Amazon example from New York City, the approach was not only are we going to bring people into a possible office, but we wanted a certain type of people. Their concept of labor gives us the ability not just to think about how much, but also what type. And put the two pieces together, and that also tells us our infrastructure. Infrastructure for everything. It's going to be the buildings, it's going to be the locations, it's going to be the equipment, it's going to be the investment. And this is going to give us a lot of things that we can think about. And when we put it all together, it gives us the ability to do other analytics. We talked a little bit before about debt. Maybe we need some kind of sponsorship. Maybe we need to do some kind of, going to the very top of the slide, mergers to work together. So it helps us look into the long term. And the way that we can do that is we can use what a lot of people think of as a SWOT analysis. SWOT: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So the approach of looking at this is a nice graphic, it's a nice chart, and as a consultant, it's a nice acronym that we use. But really, if you think about it, all it is it's really just a breakdown of the positives and negatives, the internals and the externals. And the other piece that I like when we think about the SWOT analysis, a lot of people like to think of all the positives, and therefore they like to look at the left side. They like to look at the strengths. They like to look at the opportunities. But one of the benefits of the long-term plan, the long-term analysis, is we also get to look at that right side. We also look at, hey, what do we think our weaknesses are? Where can we do some improvement so that we can make them into strengths? What are some of the threats? What are some of the challenges? This potentially comes into the external aspects of the acquisitions and the mergers and the various other pieces. So the long-term plan gives us the ability to merge that in with the SWOT analysis and kind of think of, what's our game plan? What's our goal? So how do we do this? What we need to do is we need to plan quicker. And the first thing that we want to do is we want to speed up the process. And the way that we can speed up our process is by changing our focus. So think of it more at the higher level. We said previously that we want to do higher level planning. We don't want to go down to the individual details. We don't want to go down to the individual BU. We don't want to go down to the account. We want to group things together. And this is your opportunity to make your definition of what are your groups. Do you want to group things at a very high level where maybe I'm just going to put all my sales together as one number? Do I want to set it up as smaller groups where maybe I've got different types of sales, or maybe I want to differentiate variable expenses versus fixed expenses, aspects like that? It gives us the ability to group pieces together and take us away from potentially getting into that situation where we're nitpicking on the minutia. Everybody knows the 80-20 rule. This is our opportunity to implement it. It also gives us the ability to simplify our calculations, build fewer modules, create similar types of calculations, make it easier. The overall goal of this, less is more. We want to look into our long-term plan, similar in nature to, for those of you who attended a few weeks ago, the agile planning. We want to make it quicker. We want to make it easier. The more we can get out of it, the less we plan into it, the more we might be able to get out of it. Why? What's our overall goal? Our overall goal is to have proactive risk mitigation. And I'm purposely stressing that word proactive. Our goal is to make sure that we can plan, that we can think ahead. We want to prepare for, we want to lessen the impact of the threats. We had talked before about the SWOT analysis, looking at the right side. This is our opportunity to prepare for and think about the impact of those threats. If we know what some of those threats are, we can reduce the negative effects of it. So one of my favorite quotes, as I actually look up in my office right now, is a quote that's on the wall from Ben Franklin that says, "If you fail to plan, you're planning to fail." The overall goal of what we're doing is we're planning. We're trying to be as prepared as we can so that as we think in the long term, we can figure out where we're going and then bring that back to our short term. So how do we do that? Two approaches that Revelwood recommends in regards to the long-term planning are an approach that we call growth percent, an approach that we call driver-based. So what I want to do is I want to show some live examples. I actually want to shift over to the planning analytics environment and show you this. And for those of you who haven't necessarily seen a lot of the new PAW, you'll be able to see the opportunity of a live demo in the PAW environment. For those of you who have, it's an opportunity to look into the two different methodologies, the growth percent and the driver base. And hopefully we'll be able to look at it and see both of the pieces together. So I'm going to flip over right now and I'm going to go into a live PAW environment. Okay. First one I want to look at is we'll talk a little bit about growth percent. Okay. So with growth percent, this is an example of a model which performs a full long-term plan. And in this particular example, we're focusing on the P&L. We're focusing on the revenue and the expenses. So the first screen that appears, this is where we could set up our control definitions. Okay. Source scenario. We had said earlier in the presentation that the long-term plan in most of our situations are to take data from somewhere and then use that as my starting point. This gives us the ability to define our somewhere. I can go into my source scenario and I can have a drop down that makes the determination of what scenarios and what versions do we want. and I'm actually going to log out for a moment. I'm going to log back in again. I think we had a timeout over the course of me talking before. And I'm going to go into the long-term plan. I'll go back to the portal. And I'll go into the growth percent. Okay, and based on that, now you'll see that as part of the dropdown, we have the ability where you can define for your users, what do I want as my starting point? What scenario, or some of you may reference it as categories or versions. What versions do I want to use as my starting point? We can also figure out where we're sending it to. In this particular example, we've got multiple different what ifs. We've configured this one to have 5 different what ifs, but you can have it to serve as many as you want. We definitely recommend when you're thinking long-term, when you're thinking about plans, to create at least 2 plans, best case, worst case. And whenever possible, create most realistic case, most likely situation. So we've created 5 generic buckets in this particular example for the what ifs. Well, we know where we're going to put it. So based on this particular situation, we'll be able to determine what do we want our first planning year to be. And in this particular model, we've defined it to say your source is going to be your first planning year -1. So based on the fact that I'm planning this for 2020, we're assuming that we're taking our 2019 plan, sending it out to a what if. We'll do a 5-year plan that starts in 2020 and goes out through 21, 2, 3, and 4. Okay? We can absolutely configure that. Some organizations that we've talked to have stated, I want to be able to define a different starting year. Maybe I want it to be 2 years back. Maybe I want it to be current year. That's where you have the opportunity to configure it. And because of the fact that we had defined that target scenario as a generic what if, I'm going to forget. Memory of a goldfish, a week later, I may forget. What did I mean as what if 1 and what did I mean as what if 2? And this gives me the opportunity down below to determine what do I want these descriptions to be. So for purposes right now, we've got best case, worst case. Let me change it. I'm just going to say maybe we call this the demo case. So once we update that description, now what I can do is I could say, hey, I've defined my starting points. Let me update my values. And by updating my values, now it brings me to a screen where I can start doing some of my planning. The approach associated with this plan is, and the methodology that this particular organization is using is to define, let me define my year 1%, and then I want to replicate those through years 2 through 5. So as we discussed before, the goal is to simplify the entry. All I have to do if I want to is to enter in growth percent on the left side for year 1. And how do I enter in those? I can enter them in by company. So in this particular case, we've got 6 different companies. For each of those companies, I can enter it in. One of the organizations, one of the clients that we work with, has grouped their companies together so that they have, I'm going to make up a number, 20 different companies, and they have said 6 of them fall into one bucket, 4 fall into a second bucket, 10 falls into the third bucket. Instead of planning growth percents by individual company, you can plan it by group. And here's an example where we did the exact same thing on the account side. We took all of our individual GL accounts that roll into sales, create one bucket. All of our COGS, one bucket. And we've classified them as other categories. This is where you can customize it in your own methodology. Maybe you want to break it down to variable and fixed. Maybe you want to differentiate sales. Maybe you want to make it something more granular without going too granular. And by looking at this grid, we got a big grid, but sometimes it's hard to look at a grid when you're looking at those numbers. And that's why we create some charts on the bottom. The charts will help you find anomalies. For example, I'm looking at other, and I could see most of my plans the same. Sales and marketing. Oh, wait a minute, office. This is an anomaly. This is way off. And as I look at my office, I could say, wait a minute, I don't think I want my office expenses next year to grow 12%. Let me bring it down to make it a little bit more standard, and let me bring it down to 2%. It gives us the ability to make a change immediately. And as I make that change, I could see the charts updating, and it gives me a little bit more confidence level where I could say, great, this makes sense. This looks a little bit more in terms of what I think it's going to be. And now that I've populated that 1 year, I can simply click on a button, and clicking on that button now replicates it for multiple years, for 5 years out. So that when I look at comp dynamics, I could say, hey, I had the 10% of sales and various other pieces. And as I scroll down and as I take a look at the different organization, all of that gets populated for each of the individual years. It gives me the ability to simply fill in one grid, click on a button, and now I can use those I can replicate those, and I can use those over the course of 5 years. And when I'm looking at my percentages, Most times when you plan, especially when you're planning at the detail, almost every one of our clients wants some kind of a reference. They say, hey, if I'm planning my 12 months of the current year, maybe I want to see last year, or maybe I want to see some kind of a dollar reference where I can go back and I can do comparatives. We also have the ability to look at dollar values. We have the ability to take a look at our base values. When I look at my sales, I know that I'm starting with 25.7 million. When we look at our COGS, when we look at our total expenses, and as we shift this over to the various organizations, these values will change. It gives me the ability to make it dynamic. It gives me the ability to make it flexible, but we've separated the pieces. One chart is associated with the left side. This selector is associated with the right side. I come back over to Comp Dynamics. I take a look at it. Maybe I want to do something a little different. I think that Comp Dynamics is going to have their office expenses grow 1% per year. And in year 5, I want to make it really jump out. I'm going to go back to some kind of big number. I'm going to say maybe it's 15%. And what I did is I initially said, let me take one value and replicate it out through the 5 years. But now what I have the ability to do is now I have the ability to say, I want to change one of those years. I can make it a little bit more granular without getting too granular. And how do I create my LTP? I simply click on the button that says calculate my LTP results. And now what the system's doing is it's calculating the next 5 years by growing data from the source. It's that source, meaning what we had defined before, and it's looping through every company, every account, every period within that time frame, and is growing each of those values. And now what it's doing is it brings me to the other sheet where I can analyze some of those reports. So the first thing that you see is you see the analytics. You see that I started with my plan and I'm referencing my LTP. Based on that LTP, if you remember, we changed it. We called it the demo case. This has been updated. It gives me the ability to look at that description. It gives me the ability to look at all the different years. And it allows me to dig into the results. I'm looking at total company and I can see charts and I can see graphs and I can see data. Maybe I want to look at just Comp Dynamics and it gives me the ability to look at some of the values there. Maybe I'm looking at CompuCom and you can see that all the charts and the pieces change. Some of the charts. Maybe I'm doing a breakdown of my OPEX year over year where I can take a look at my total OPEX and the breakdown. Maybe I want to do some kind of a comparative report where I'm looking at a couple of years of plan. We had said that we're starting with 2019 and then we're growing it 5 years out. Makes it very clear, makes it very easy for us to look at. I'm going to go back to Comp Dynamics. That's a little more positive where it grows. And you can differentiate what are my plan numbers in blue? What are my long-term numbers in green? Okay. And now what we can do is we can reassess the overall plan. If we don't like the results, I look at this and I say, oh, some of these numbers got pretty big. Look at some of these growth pieces. Now, if I come back, I can go back to Comp Dynamics and I can say, I don't like that number. I want to go back to, maybe I'll grow a little bit. Maybe I'll grow to 2%. And the fact that all I had to do is flip back one screen, click on a button, wait maybe 10 seconds or so, I can repeatedly try iterations of this process. This is where the multiple LTP plans come into play, because knowing that it's so fast, knowing that I can do this in just a matter of 10, 15 seconds, something like that, I can continuously do iterations. And now what I also have the ability to do is I did that fast pace. I did that percentage and I said grow. Okay? But what I can do is maybe now I say, great, now that I've got a starting point, and I want to change some of the individual pieces. We saw before that we had individual companies or individual departments or something like that. Maybe what we want to do is maybe now we want to cap some of the numbers. So maybe I can go into, I can go into travel. Maybe we say next year we don't want this much travel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I don't think I want people to have $500,000 in travel. At the consolidated level, now what I could do is I could say, I'm just going to put that as $100,000. And I could set it down a little bit. And what happened is when I went down to travel, now it did my high level plan. It spread it proportionally based on some of the numbers that are there. I can plan it at a bottom level and say, you know what? Maybe the airfare is going to be a little more expensive based on some of the situations. I'm going to go up to 80,000. Since I'm in 80,000, I'll just do 80K. And it works its way back up. And I can continue to do iterations where I go top down, bottoms up. And based on that, I now have the ability to take my starting point and make some changes. Maybe I have something else. Maybe under the rent side. Maybe I know that I have a new rent contract coming up in year 2. Maybe I know that it's going to have some kind of a number, some kind of a growth. So what I can do is I can go back into my office rent and I could say, hey, you know what? These are pretty decent numbers. I think it's really only going to, I just negotiated a new contract. It's got a 2% increase. It starts at 1.2 million. I can update that by simply just typing 1.2M, 1.2 million, and now I've updated a number. Now I could say I know that there was a 2% increase. I grow 2, and what's going to happen is that 1.2 million grows. It gave me that starting point. It gave me the ability to do bottoms up, top down, granular planning. I can plan at a group level where I have office, and office has a whole bunch of different accounts, or I can go down into smaller accounts. And I can do comparatives where I'm looking at plan over plan or breakdowns or details like that. And it gives me the ability to run multiple iterations pretty quickly and use anything I want as a starting point. Okay. So what is it? Modifying the existing values, adjusting them via percent, what we just talked about. Gives us the ability to group pieces together, gives us consolidated time where we're taking a look at it. What are the pros? It's pretty quick to set up. It's easy to set up because really all I'm doing is I'm creating a higher level version of some of the pieces I already have. Higher level accounts, higher level time, higher level groupings. It's very easy to use. You saw that it was as simple as me putting in one number on a percent, click on a button, and that replicated it to the 5 years out. And then I click on one more button and it did all the calculations for me. But the biggest pro to this is it's configurable to your environment. My example showed that we had sales. My example showed that we had COGS, but maybe we break it down. It gives you the ability to customize and configure it based on how you want. Okay. But with every pro, there's a con. One of the cons associated with this is it may require some new cubes because of the fact that we're creating things at a consolidated level, because of the fact that we're creating some of those percentages in the groupings. You may require some new cubes to put into your model. Okay. Second approach, driver-based. Okay. What's a driver-based model? It's where we can use operational activities to calculate key variable revenue and expenses. Really what that is it's define drivers. Defining what am I going to do and how am I going to use that. Define the drivers. Maybe I'm putting in units for sales. Maybe I'm putting in average price. If I'm doing salary and labor, maybe I'm looking at headcount. Define the calculations. In almost every situation, it's some kind of an X times Y or an X divided by Y. Like we saw in some of the earlier slides, keep it simple. Define the calculations as some kind of a simple calculation. Typically, it's A times B or A divided by B. Okay. So let's shift back over to a demo again. Driver-based. This right here is an example of a model which performs a long-term plan, but we're only focusing on the revenue this side. Okay. So the first screen, unit pricing. This is where we can define the price for each item. Okay. We can have this configured to be by month, by region, a whole bunch of different levels. But again, I'm keeping this at a high level. I want to go granular, but not too granular. So in this particular case, we're just looking at one price for each of the appropriate 6 years. We're looking at some kind of a bucket for our product. Okay. We have the ability to do some of the things we talked about before. I know that maybe I want this to $100. I think that's a little bit cheap. Maybe I want this to be $150. I can put $150 and change a value. I can also mass load. I could put in $150 and I'm just going to point an arrow to the right and say make it $150 for every one of the years. Gives me the ability to do bottoms up planning, repetitive planning, those kinds of aspects, same things that we were looking at before. And now that we've defined a price, now we can define the driver base. This is where driver-based unit planning comes into play. Okay. So what we're looking at now is we defined our price. Now let's look at our units. This is where we can look at our items. Right here, we look at high-end computers. Here's a bunch of units. We've got some charts and graphs showing our regions and how are things looking. We can make a selection and come back to our low-end computers, and we can see different aspects of it. And now what we have the ability to do is we have the ability to do the planning just like we did before. I can do things at a low level. I can go into Northeast and I could say for the low end computer, hey, maybe here I don't think that's going to be 600. That's not enough of a growth. Maybe I want that to be 650. I can see live results, and you didn't really see much of a growth. Let me purposely make it 6,500 just to show an example of something that would change immediately. I go back to the 650. I could set it up where I plan at the base level. Just like before, I could do consolidated planning. I think that a few years from now, I'm hoping that I've grown a little bit more over that. So instead of making this 11.4, maybe I make it 15,000. And when I put the 15,000 in, not only is it going to put numbers down to the base level, it's going to put it down proportionally. You see the immediate results in the charts. Just like before, we can use the different approaches. We can use letters. We can use numbers. We can use the growth percent, various other aspects just like that. And then within the revenue analysis. Now, I did an entire plan. I filled in units, I filled in prices. All it was an X times Y. Now I have the ability to do analytics where I slice and dice even further. This is where I could take a look at my various pieces. Right now, I'm looking at the Northeast. I can see here's the graph of the Northeast, here's the time period and the values. And in this particular case, I'm looking at my overall plan. Maybe I want to change this as I look year over year. Paul gives us that configurable approach where these three pieces change, but this doesn't. I'm looking at the long term. I'm looking at the bigger picture. And as I change things year over year, the intricate data changes, but the overall doesn't. And I have the ability to change my look and feel. When I'm looking at the Northeast, it's going to show me Northeast data and a Northeast graph. Maybe if I want to look at the West, it's going to make it a little bit bigger. It's going to show me the whole West Coast, and it shows me some data. Maybe I still want to see everything over the entire United States. Maybe based on my region, I want to look at the entire US and only show me the things that pop out. It gives me the ability to analyze and look at the data while also configuring what do I want to change, what don't I want to change, and just like before, I can flip back and forth, where now I'm looking at low-end computers in the Southwest, 2022, here's some numbers. I can flip back over here and I can look at the Southwest and I can change some of the numbers, high level, low level, and keep flipping back and forth. Okay. High level, X times Y, quick planning, but a lot of analytics in regards to the details behind that. Okay. Pros. Quick to set up. Once we define our drivers, that's really the meat and potatoes of driver-based planning. What are my drivers? Once you've defined that business aspect, once you've defined what your drivers are, it's quick to set up. It minimizes the number of elements, it minimizes the number of dimensions, it minimizes the number of cubes. In essence, it minimizes your model. Based on that, it's quick to set up because it's much smaller. It's much easier to navigate, it's much easier to use, but it's just as detailed as some of the other aspects that you were looking at. But the con, because of the fact that it's at a higher level, because of the fact that it's easier, it may not provide as much detail as you're used to seeing. So something to keep in mind is the great thing about long-term planning, the great thing about driver base is it's designed to be fast and easy. It's designed to give you the high-level picture. But the hard part is for some people to think about, it's designed to give you that high-level picture. It's not designed to be as granular. It's not designed to be as specifically intricate. Okay. So now that we've seen a couple things in theory, let's talk about some real-life examples. Okay. Client examples of the long-term planning. So one of our clients does their long-term plan by setting up before the budget. So the first thing they do is they create a 5-year plan starting with the most recent forecast. The forecast is at a very detailed level, normal budget, and the 5-year plan is done at a much higher level. And they do this via the growth method. For example, they just say that I want a 10% increase in revenue, and then they calculate the results. Once they've created that 5-year plan, then they get board approval. And that board approval, once they get that final board approval, then they begin their detailed budget. They begin their detailed budget by using those year one values. They take the results of that high-level plan, and they use it as a reference point for their detailed budget. 5-year plan doesn't become a waste. The 5-year plan becomes the exact opposite. It actually becomes the starting point for them to create their detailed budget. Timing, again, it's part of the budget. One of our clients does it by creating a 5-year plan continuously. They're constantly working on a 5-year plan, and they're using the most recent LTP. They're using the most recent long-term plan as their starting point. The way they create it is they use a combination of the pieces we talked about from the time. They do year one by month. They do year two by quarter. They do years three through 5 by year. Remember that very first slide where we talked a little bit about the granularity and that the further you go out, the less you know? This client utilizes that. That's why year one is by month, year 5 is by year. And then what they do is they can pre-populate their budget by using the numbers from their previous LTP. They take their year 2, which is originally done by quarter, they split it evenly over the course of X over 3, and that's how they take their year 1 monthly starting point. They take their year 3, which was previously done by year, they split it evenly down to the quarter, X over 4, that's how they create their year 2. Their years 4 and 5 become their years 3 and 4. They give them a starting point. They don't do a zero-based long-term plan. They use some kind of a pre-populated by continuously working with what we have while also merging together the aspect of going out further. And another client that does it, they do the exact opposite. They go after the budget. So what they do is they use the existing detailed budget as the source, and then they plan 3 to 5 years out. This particular client does it at the consolidated level. They use it off the growth approach, and this is where you can determine what kind of method do you want to use to be able to create your long-term budget. So you can see that this approach, this aspect associated with long-term planning can be done at any level. I could start with my long-term plan and use it for my detail. I could start with my detail and use it to make my long-term plan, or I could do something in between. Okay. But the overall goal, the overall pattern that we're seeing here, short-term budget is very detailed. The long-term budget is more at a consolidation level. Okay. So what do you want to think about when you're defining that long-term process? Okay. Remember the approach. I've probably said it at least a dozen times. Now we'll make it in even 13 right now and say, remember, as you're thinking about the long-term plan, think of it as more of a higher level plan. Whether you're looking at a driver approach, whether you're looking at a growth approach, whether you're looking at some kind of a top-down consolidated approach, the goal of a long-term plan is to plan at a higher level. Yeah, we can use it to get down to granular detail, but keep it at a higher level. Other things to think about, drivers. One of the big key phrases, it's the fancy term that's being used a lot now, and people continue to push it. And I constantly get people talking to me about, tell me what you know about driver-based planning. It's a great approach. It's very easy to use. We have a lot of people in today's existing environment who are saying, I created a detailed budget based on what I think 2020 is going to be. Well, the world has changed. The world has changed over the past couple of months. I need a quick and dirty way to change that. Driver-based. The open issue, the thing to think about is, what kind of drivers do I want to use? When I'm looking at the revenue, sales volumes, number of customers, average selling price. When I look at my expenses, what are my COGS percents? What are my number of employees? What are my average benefits? And the way that you think about these drivers to use are a combination of what's important to my business? What kind of numbers am I trying to get? What kind of results am I trying to get? And how do I get there? But also by thinking, how do I keep those calculations simple? Try to keep your calculation as a simple X times Y, or in my slide, I could see A times B. Maybe you have 3 parts. Maybe you have A times B times C. Maybe you have some kind of divider where I want to look at averages or I want to look at aspects. But either way, every one of these calculations is designed to be a simple calculation. We don't have situations where I'm looking at month over month and I'm doing a FICA calculation and trying to figure out, did I hit my threshold and did I have a max and do I need to look up bonus plans and all those kinds of things? I'm simply just saying, I sold 50 units, they're $10 each, my revenue is $500, 50 times 10. Keep it simple. In the future state, IBM is working on adding AI, artificial intelligence, adding the AI-based predictive forecasting capabilities into the planning analytics environment. Okay? When you look at this chart, when you look at this graph, it's similar in concept to what we saw on that simple dot chart, on the line chart without the lines, where the blue lines are what the plan is. The pieces with the shading on the side, the IBM person that I spoke to, one of the developers, he calls that the envelope. Based on the envelope, that right there is where we come into the predictive. And what we see is that envelope gets bigger and bigger as you go out, less confidence as we go out further. And mostly this is due to unknowns in the existing variables. Maybe there's new variables. It gives us the ability to think through various aspects of predictive. Confidence level, what kinds of pieces are coming into play, what's my accuracy, what are the various trends. But IBM is currently working on building that artificial intelligence, building that AI approach into the predictive model. So not only do we have the ability to do some of those mechanisms like growth percents and number of units and pieces like that, the predictive can get merged in so that maybe off this predictive, I can have the system calculate for me. I think it's going to be a 6% growth. Maybe the system can calculate for me. I think my units are going to be a little bit more. Okay? It gives me the opportunity, it gives me the ability to not necessarily, to still do the same approach with long term, but not necessarily put the onus on all the individual planners. But just like everything else, you still want to have the individual planners getting into the details. This gives us the ability to pre-populate it. And we also want to take other things into consideration. Okay? We want to think through, how is this going to impact our performance? Will any new models impact your overall performance? Does your existing model need to be tuned up? What's going to happen if I add new, I can't do a presentation without saying my favorite word. What happens if I add new stuff into the system? If I add a new cube, how's that going to impact the existing system? How's it going to impact rules? How's it going to impact calculations? If I modify some of the calculations, how's that going to impact the feeders? How's that going to impact the overall performance? These are the kinds of things that you want to think about. And you also want to take that into consideration, not necessarily just for implementing the long-term plans, but also thinking about it, in essence, planning for your long-term plan. Revelwood offers a service that we call a performance tune-up, and the goal of that performance tune-up is to do exactly this. It's to look at your existing system, start planning for the future, thinking about what are some of the things that are going slow right now, but more importantly, what are some of the things that are going to impact you? This is actually a great opportunity. Right now is a great time to do that, because a lot of the clients that I'm talking to, a lot of the clients I've been working with have been saying, we are all over the place, physically, geographically, technologically right now. It doesn't make sense for us to build a new model. But I know that I want to build a new model, and I know I want to do some new calculations and some new, again, I'm going to use my word, some new stuff over the course of when we get back on track. This is the perfect time for you to think about, how is that going to impact my overall performance? Okay. And with that being said, I'm going to turn it back over to Stan.
Okay, thanks, Lee. I appreciate that. Very good presentation. We did have a question that came in that I think I'll let you take a stab at. So the question is it recommended to perform worst case, best case, most likely scenario loading to be TI driven or rule driven? Any opinions on that, Lee?
The answer, the recommendation I would make is it depends on the model. If it turns out that it is based on a new model, then I think rules are great. If it turns out that it's based on an existing model, then I would go more towards TI. And it's similar in nature to an allocation process. When you look at allocations, you want to run things on demand. And most of the clients that we work with say, I don't need allocations to constantly be calculated. I don't need feeders. I don't need the memory. I don't need my results to be updated constantly. Based on that, I would do the same thing with your long term. If it turns out that you're creating a new driver-based model that's designed solely for the purpose of a long-term plan, let it calculate all the time, use rules. If it's something where you're growing your existing model and you've got a lot of granular details and you've got a lot of pieces where you do want it to do the iterations and you want to see the results of something and don't necessarily change them until the next time I change my results, that's where I would recommend going down to a TI script.
Okay, great. So one last point of information. Lee provided a demonstration in an interface called PAL, or Planning Analytics Workspace. That is an interface that is available in Planning Analytics. Some of the attendees on the call is probably using that today in their environment. Probably everyone has been exposed to that or has an idea of what that is, but Revelwood specializes in all facets of planning analytics. So if you're interested specifically in that interface and some of the pros and cons of what it may be able to bring to your current implementation, certainly we can set up individual sessions to visit with Paul, as well as discuss the long-term planning aspects or questions that you may have from the webinar. With that said, I want to thank, on behalf of Revelwood, everyone for joining the webinar today. Glad that you were able to attend some of the series of webinars that we're providing during this unique time with the COVID-19 crisis, and stay tuned for future webinars. If anyone wants a copy or a recording of the webinar, please reach out to me directly. You see my contact information, and I will be glad to forward that information to you. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today.